Hello, and welcome to this first in a series of talks from the Academy of Interactive Entertainment to help you get started with your STEM Game Development Challenge. My name's Craig Bentick. I'm a game developer with a long and storied history of experience, but today I'd like to talk to you guys about getting started with your project, coming up with an idea and how you might be able to structure your team in a way that gives you the best possible chance for success. So, we will be talking about generating your ideas. So I'm going to talk about how to work in a group, look at ideas, and ultimately come to a decision on what the direction for your project is going to be. It's a really important thing for everybody to be on the same page when you start out, because then you're all kind of moving in the same direction and you're all headed toward the same overall goal. So I'll also be looking at some of the different roles that are involved in game development and some strategies that you can use in your groups and discussions to kind of get to that point quickly and to ensure that everybody kind of feels like their voice has been heard. That's often sometimes a problem in group work, that some people feel like they get heard more than others. There's this old adage about the dog who barks loudest gets their way, or the squeaky wheel gets the grease, I think, or whatever it is. Those two seem like competing things, but we'll move on anyway. All right. We can all agree on this very, very simply. Games are super awesome. They are the best ever. They have the ability to entertain, excite, and inspire us and kind of make us envision things that we didn't envision before. They can also allow us to understand concepts or ideas that we didn't understand before because there is an interactive element there. So for a lot of people, myself included, this often helps an idea or a concept, such as one that's in science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, to stick in my brain a lot more effectively than if I was reading it on a page or if I had to try and solve an equation on paper or even with the help of a computer. Being able to actually get in and visualize and kind of interact with a problem and see it articulated in a different way is often a really powerful tool. And that's, I think, part of what you're going to be trying to achieve. In games, even if you don't think you're learning anything, you are actually learning how to master what we call the mechanics of that game. And that's fundamentally what games are all about. Training the player to be able to utilize those mechanics to do well in the game. If you don't, you lose the game. It goes all the way back to the, dust and wood ages of medieval times that's kind of games would have mechanics in them and rule sets and things that you would have to do in order to win. So the example that I would give would be something like in a first-person game, you can move around, you can run and jump. Something like Minecraft, you would be learning about resource collection and construction and the management of those resources. Like, even if you don't think you're learning anything, sometimes the mechanics of a game can get you to understand that more effectively than you might otherwise. So, we're going to deconstruct what games are just a little bit, in case you're not aware. And I don't want to ruin games for you, but generally speaking, games can be built upon a set of rules, situations, and mechanics. Now, this is just one school of thought amongst a huge range of thoughts that people have about game design. But the way I'll describe it is that rules define what the player must do to win. The situation defines the context and parameters of that challenge. So what scenario are you putting them in where they have to operate within those rules and use the mechanics to satisfy that challenge? So the mechanics are, generally speaking, defined by the actions that the player can take to address that challenge. And the important part there is the actions the player can take. So often you'll have, with very complex games, a lot of different mechanics or things that the player can do to solve a particular problem or to get out of a particular situation or complete the challenge that's been put in front of them. So we have to come up with an idea as a team. Or I know some of you might be working as an individual, and this stuff should apply just as effectively to what you're doing as well. So one approach that I've found works well for short-term game jams, and that's kind of how I'm talking about this, where you'll have maybe 48 hours, maybe a week, to come up with an idea. You get given a theme or a concept and have to build a game in a very, very short amount of time. So to me, this applies quite well to what you guys are doing. So I would have an overall discussion about how to address the challenge with the team. what types of gameplay that we know of could be interesting or unique to apply to the theme. So whatever constraints you've been given to work within, how can you creatively apply something that you already recognize from other games to that idea in order to effectively express it? Now, once you've kind of come up with some of those ideas, don't go too in depth with them straight away. Write them down really quickly, really brief, what I would say like 2-sentence descriptions that we will call an elevator pitch. So the player must do X in order to Y so that Z, or Z. I forget the American English way. I don't know. I deal with Americans. It's a really quick way. You want to be able to express it in the time it gets, the time it would take you to get from the ground floor to level 2. If you can get someone's attention and explain it to them and they understand what you're describing to a kind of broad level, then that's probably a pretty solid idea. And it forces you to think about something very simple and not get stuck on the details just yet. Once you have a few of those down, pick a subset of ones that people seem excited about or that seem to have kind of gotten good buy-in from the team. Everybody's kind of like, oh, I like that one and I like that other one too. Those are pretty cool. And then we'll explore them in a little bit more depth. So you've kind of gone, blap, let's have the brain explosion where we get all of the ideas down as quickly as we can, and then we'll pick the best ones to actually invest our time in, to look at the pros and cons. So you have your elevator pitches. How do we actually assess that idea and choose one? So let's take a small subset of those ideas and ask ourselves some questions that we can use to determine how practical or how achievable each of those ideas might be. So the broad, high-level things that we want to look at is, how long do we expect this idea to take? I mean, just an absolute rough ballpark. Are we talking about trying to make GTA, or are we talking about trying to make something that's a very simple, sort of screen-based kind of puzzle game or something like that? I mean, those can be incredibly complex as well, but based upon the skills that you have and the knowledge you have, how long would you expect to have to do this idea? And if it's outside the timeline that you have, then maybe it's not the best one to go with. Now, the other thing that we can look at is how complex the idea is for each discipline. And I'll talk about the disciplines in a little bit more detail in a minute, but fundamentally, is it going to be really lopsided? Is it going to be all about the designer having to do all of these crazy puzzle designs and level layouts, and the art doesn't really have to do that much, and the programmers maybe don't have to do so much? I mean, is it a balanced thing? Is it something that you can kind of spread out and have an equal workload amongst those people? And that kind of comes back to the idea of fairness. If people want to contribute, do they have a fair opportunity to contribute? And then the final one will be, how well does it address the challenge? So whatever the constraints are that you're working in, the topic or the time frame, whatever you have, how well is it addressing that? Is it achieving the purpose that it's meant to? And we would often refer to that as the brief. Like if you were if you were getting a contract to work on something, you would be given a brief that says, you will do this, the product needs to do this and that and the other, but you would be able to determine how you go about doing that. But you would know the parameters that you had to satisfy in order to get paid or whatever. So there are some more questions, right? And this gets more into sort of the design area of it, but everybody needs to be able to answer these questions and feel satisfied with it. What is the core mechanic? What is the action that the player performs most of the time and most repeatedly? So for something like Mario, I'm going to keep coming back to that. It is jumping. And it might be, movement as well. So running and jumping is the thing that Mario does the most. He can bump into blocks that maybe have mushrooms come out or the blocks explode, but those are as a result of Mario jumping. So that is a really important critical part of that game that has to feel right and has to work really effectively, and it's used constantly. You'll see the number of different ways with something like Mario Maker now, where people can create their own Mario levels. The way that they use some of the puzzles they can create and make really difficult paths that the player has to, duck and run and jump and bounce and double jump and all this crazy stuff, that's a result of that core mechanic being really, really effective and really well tuned. Then we can ask ourselves what the core loop of the game is. How are we presenting a challenge to the player? how do we allow the player to complete it and then give them some kind of reward? This comes back to one of these kind of underlying principles of game design where we do something in order to get something from it. If it's smashing into a block to get a mushroom so that we can get bigger and maybe take another hit later down the line, that is a loop in itself, in something like a puzzle game. I'm coming back to that a little bit as a touchstone because it's a really good way to kind of compact the idea of the design. So the player will be able to choose which puzzle they want to do or see the next level they need to do. They will be presented with the puzzle. They will be informed as to what the mechanic is that they need to use to solve that puzzle. If it's moving the blocks into the right location to solve a jigsaw puzzle, then that's what that core would be. Once they've completed that puzzle, what happens? They see the picture finished, maybe it does something cool, they go, yay, I did it, and then they're back looping to that initial point where they can choose the next puzzle that they want to solve. In other games, it's completing the level. In other games, it's getting experience points so that they can unlock upgrades and things like that. When we talk about the secondary loop, that's kind of what we're talking about as well. So what is a larger goal that the player has to achieve to complete that game? Is it solving a number of puzzles, collecting a certain number of coins? How many levels are you going to have them complete? That's kind of how you wrap that core loop. So I view it as that core loop is something that you do continuously, and you get a continuous level of feedback from that. But then at a certain point, there is a larger objective. Mario has to save the princess. That's the whole point of that game. But each world will have a castle that he needs to get to in order to be told the princess is in another castle. So they're kind of wrapping each level in a world. That world is wrapped in an entire game. So if we think about it from those different perspectives, that can help illustrate what those loops are. This is not to suggest that you need to make a game that has multiple levels. If you have one mechanic that you demonstrate really well and is really fun to do, there's no reason that that can't be the entirety of your game. I don't know what the parameters are for you, but keep something like that in mind. And also, what are the win-lose conditions? How are you actually wrapping the game like that? Do you have a certain number of lives or attempts at a particular thing, or is there some kind of time limit? Things like match 3 games like Candy Crush and that sort of thing will often have things like a time limit or a move limit. So you have a certain number of opportunities to move blocks into certain locations in order to get enough points to finish the level. And that's another way of kind of wrapping that win-lose condition, and not just simply have the player continue to do this thing forever with no defined end point. So this is where we start to get into the slightly more technical side of things, and I'm going to make this document available to your teachers and to you as well, so you can look at it and pull it apart more. Once you have an idea of what the core loop and the mechanics might be, start to think about how practical it is for you to make it. What are the technical requirements to create those mechanics? Right, I'm going to need to, code this part of it. I'm going to need the programmer to do this thing. We're going to need the artist to create this. We're going to need to design this part of it. We're going to need this many of that thing, and kind of just pull it apart very quickly in this meeting. So you go, well, I don't know how we would do that. Does anyone know how we would do that? I don't. That sounds pretty out there. Can we put that one to the side for a second and look at the other ones? Because that seems totally bonkers. We love the idea, but we don't know how we would go about doing it. So we can't estimate whether or not it would be successful. Is there stuff that you already have experience doing that could help you articulate that idea? Can you kind of start from that point and say, well, we know how to make this type of thing. How does this shape into the challenge? And how do we solve that? What are the risks? So this is kind of talking about the technical requirements. Look for red flags, things that certain people in the team might go, whoa, that sounds really risky. I don't know about that thing. And then somebody else might come up with an idea saying, well, what about if we did this instead? That would serve the same purpose, but it would be done in a slightly different way. That person who brings up the red flag might go, well, actually, that's really clever. I hadn't thought of that. That's awesome. Let's do that. So you kind of think about it at a technical level. Again, relatively quickly, just try and identify those big red flags. Think about what your visual theme will be. So this is how you're going to visually present whatever your gameplay is. How much art is actually going to need to be created to do this? How much can you reuse? So, for instance, I'll come back to Mario. I don't know why I keep doing that. It's just an easy fallback. the grass blocks in that world, or the brick blocks that sit in the air, they're all the same block. And if you look at the green bushes in the background of Super Mario and look at the clouds in Super Mario, they're actually the same asset, but one is colored green and one is colored kind of a pale blue. So that's a case where they're reusing something for a different purpose, but it still works. Nobody ever questions that. You go, yeah, it's a bush, it's a cloud, it's fine, it doesn't matter. And how does the visual style that you're going to choose relate to or reinforce the challenge? Does it fit with what you need to do? Does it fit the audience that's going to be consuming this thing? You know, you might have a cool visual style that you want to do for a game anyway, but if it doesn't really fit the idea and isn't going to make the project ultimately more effective, then maybe you want to think about something a little bit different, or potentially much simpler. That's the thing, like, art doesn't have to be ridiculously complex. You can keep things incredibly simple and still get the point across. And then finally, I talk a little bit about personality. So, you know, how is your idea unique? Is there a personality that you can apply to it? Is there a sense of humor or a particular tone that you want the project to have? This is kind of far less important, I think, than the other stuff we're talking about. Far less important than some of the technical ones, but it is something to consider. How will you differentiate your project from other projects that might be somewhat similar, and what would make yours unique? Okay, so we've answered those questions. The team should have a good understanding of each of those ideas, what work's going to be required, and ultimately what we call the scope of the project. How big a bite of this thing are you taking out, and can you handle it? So this is also a good opportunity for the initial creative discussion to sort of blat out all of the possible ideas that come from that elevator pitch. So those should be documented, even if they're crazy pie in the sky things, because you never know where you're going to end up. You don't necessarily know where things are going to lead. So if somebody has an idea and they seem really passionate about it, or they're really excited, definitely write it down, but make sure that everybody understands you have this is the realistic, definite thing that we want to try and do. And then these are all the things that are really nice to have, that we all agree are cool and we would love to do, but aren't necessarily the most important thing for us to finish this game. Because in that way, that person has been heard. You've got that idea in case you have the time to do it, and if it turned out to be important. And it arms you really well if you want to take the game further. So now you can actually land on which idea you want to go with, safe in the knowledge that you have chosen something pretty achievable. And that brings up scope. So it's the complexity or scale of your project. So what happens is everybody gets really excited and we throw out all of these ideas, and we have this term of scope creep or feature creep, where you just keep sticking things onto that initial idea to the point where you can't even lift it. It's just too heavy to carry. There's too much on there. And more importantly, you can put so much stuff on the outside of that project that it ends up that you can't even see what the original thing was. You can't see what was really important about that idea in the elevator pitch in the first place. So you want to try and keep it as simple as you can and avoid that scope creep. And when you are deciding what features to add, think about it in terms of what is the player going to actually care about. Are they going to care about this cool little extra thing that you added that took someone 4 days to do, but doesn't really get seen and doesn't make the whole game better? You're better off spending your time working on something that's reused a lot, or something that can improve the player's experience or their understanding of the game, you know, teaching them the rules a little bit better, or reinforcing them when they do something well, or educating them when they do something incorrectly. So not punishing them, but going, here's why you did that thing wrong. It's okay that you did that wrong, but here's why. And you can do better next time. So what else have we got? All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about team roles, and I'll check whether I'm getting the wrap up here. I've got someone in chat that's going to let me know if I'm, running out of time. So in all likelihood, given the nature of your challenge, you will probably be wearing a number of different hats. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that one of you will be the programmer, one will be the artist, one will be designer, one will be project manager, or any of these things. You'll all be having some kind of role in each of those bits. You'll all be contributing to that work. It's just a question of how much of that you need to take on, or how you in your team divide up that responsibility. So an artist will be creating visual assets and the look of the game. The designer will focus on the gameplay, the player experience, and the overall game loop. So the designer will kind of be an advocate for the player, saying, well, the player's not really going to care about this, or we really need to make sure they understand this, where there might be competing interests or competing priorities within the team. They can speak for the player in a way. The programmer will create the functionality for the game and implement the mechanics. The project manager is a really kind of thankless role, but it's really important. It's someone who's keeping track of the timeline of the project and working out where certain milestones or due dates will be. So you might say, after the first 2 weeks, or so, I don't know what your time frame is, but 2 weeks in, we want to have a really rough version of that core mechanic working so that we can test it and make sure it's going to work and be fun and all of that stuff before we have the artists start putting all of the art in. So that's an important role to have, but you can all kind of collaborate on that role. And I think it's important that you do, because you all need to agree on those times and not feel like somebody else is telling you you have to do something in a certain amount of time. You need to feel as though I agreed to do it in that time, and if I don't do it, it's my own fault. But I want to support the team, so I will. And then I've listed an audio artist there as well, because that's an important job. And people always leave sound to the last minute. It's always the last thing that they do. And often that suffers. But audio can really bring a game to life. If it's missing, you definitely notice it. So keep that in mind. And think about what roles your particular game will require. It will probably require a different balance of these skills depending on what you are going to build. So I've got some breakdowns here of what the different disciplines can do. If I'm running over time, somebody let me know and I can just make this stuff available to everyone. But things like finding reference images, creating what we call mood boards, which are like collages of a bunch of different images that you stick together and say, all right, outside the game is going to look like this, or inside it's going to look like that, or this character could look like this, or this has just got really inspiring colors in it that I feel like could be really good for us to look at and think about when we design stuff like the user interface. What do the buttons look like? What does the text look like? That kind of a thing. So providing that kind of visual inspiration for the rest of the team, as well as creating concept art. So actually doing sketches and designs, and if you're into your 3D modeling, you can maybe make some prototype models, that kind of a thing. But generally that wants to be pretty quick so that the team can get an idea for what the specific visual style is going to be for the game. The other thing that's really handy is where an artist can work with a designer, and this is really, really useful for you, to sketch up and actually storyboard the various screens that are going to be in the game. So you would have something like a main menu. Well, sit down with the artist and the designer can just draw out on a napkin some boxes going, the buttons will be there and we need this many buttons and this needs to be the options and that sort of thing. The artist can go, well, it'd be really cool if we did a thing where they were kind of arranged like this and they had these colors and had this type of text on them and stuff. And then what you end up with is not just a visual idea of that, but the designer has to actually go through the entire player journey and say, all right, the first screen is going to be this, and then they click new game, and then what options do they have? Does that just take them straight into the first level, or is there something they need to pick? Do they need to type their name in? And that's a critical job for a designer to do, to work out what the structure, what the flow of that game is going to be. And then finally, you've got creating either 2D or 3D assets and implementing those into the game with the help of a programmer if need be. So things like animation as well, if you're going to have that, although that can be time consuming if you haven't done it before. So here are some examples of what some concept art looks like. This one's from a game called Overgrowth, with some simple sketches of some items that might exist in the world. So it's not necessarily concepting a huge environment. It might be as simple as, what does this toolbox look like? Okay, it looks like that. And then we've got some Portal 2 storyboards, which are actually for a gameplay sequence, because the game doesn't have cinematics. It's actually showing step by step. All right, so then the box will fall down here. The player will look at this thing, they're going to run over here, they're going to do this, and all that good stuff. So it's a good way to kind of visually outline what a sequence of events in the game might be. So the designer, as I said, will be the player advocate. They will speak for the player and prioritize their experience in conversations with the team. They're kind of a little bit of a gatekeeper in a way. They can kind of go, that idea is not going to add to this. Let's keep this design really, really simple, or let's focus on making the core of it really good. They should be a level-headed person and be a bit diplomatic, so they have the ability to listen to other people really well and not get too tied up in their own ideas as well. Like the first role that you'll have at this initial stage is getting people to share their thoughts and ideas and get excited, and kind of be the person, I think, standing at the whiteboard or with the piece of paper who's writing down, that's really good, everybody likes that, so not necessarily just using their own sense of what should be done or what they think is good or what they think the best idea is, but gauging the room and having an idea of what everybody else kind of feels excited about and what feels realistic. They are also not the owner. Often what happens is that the designer will be considered to be some kind of dictator who's in control of everything. They're not. They're another collaborator in the team, and they are supposed to kind of guide things and protect the team along with the project manager and keep things achievable. So as I said, prompts discussion and collects ideas and facilitates agreement within the team. That sounds really hoity-toity, kind of nerdy sort of thing, but it really is someone who you want to be able to go, hey, Tom and Jenny, you both seem to be talking about slightly the same thing. So maybe if you guys get together and talk about that, we will have a really cool idea come out of it, because they might be arguing about something and you go, you're talking about the same thing. What about this? They're kind of the mediator as well. So here are some examples of work that a designer might do, where we actually see a storyboard for what we call a user journey through this particular application. It's all the different screens that the user would go through, along with connections to and from them, indicating what the flow of that is going to be. And then we've got an example of a level layout, a design for where the player might move in a level or what's accessible, that they would probably work on with an artist. But that would ultimately be something quite useful and quite handy. So a programmer will create the functionality that the game rests on. They implement the mechanics based upon the design. They will work with artists and designers to ensure that their work is presented correctly. So if they see, oh, that texture doesn't look right, it's flipped backwards, they will say to the artist, hey, that's backwards. Is there a reason that's backwards? And they go, no. And they go, okay, well then I'll fix that at a technical level, or you can fix that in your asset that you're putting into the game, that kind of a thing. They should be able to advise on things that might be too complex for the time frame available. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. You definitely want everybody to kind of be going, I don't know if we could do that, but whoever has experience with programming in your team would probably be the person you'd want to listen to as far as this feature is probably risky. And that person also needs to be realistic with themselves and not necessarily go, I'd love to make this thing. I don't know how I do it, but I'm going to say I can do it, and it's going to be amazing, and I'll be brilliant, and I'll be a genius when I've done that thing. That is reckless, and it is not good for the product. You should only commit to things that you are 90% sure that you can do from the outset. That doesn't mean don't be ambitious. It just means be cautious. The other ability that's really good for a programmer to have is the ability to talk to people who aren't technical to explain what they're doing, or explain why the thing they're asking for might be, good or bad, or what the other consequences of that thing might be from a technical point of view, and let them understand, as I say, how the game ticks, how it actually operates, and where the thing they're talking about fits into the way that the game works. As I said, the project manager will handle things like timeframes and due dates and help break down all of the tasks that you all talk about and agree to. You go, well, how do we actually go about building this? That's what I'll be talking about next week. But to begin with, you kind of go, all right, what are all the blocks that we need to do? What are all the tasks? What order do they need to happen in? And how much time do we have to do each of these things? How realistic is that? And letting the team know that, all right, we've got 4 days until we need to deliver this thing, and it's not really there yet, is it? So that involves working closely with each team member to understand the work that they're doing and help factor that into the timeline. So the other thing that I want to make really clear that's really important is the idea of a build review and testing your project. So here's an example. The whole team gets into a room or gets online or however you do it and reviews the game from start to finish. You play it from booting it up all the way through to either the game crashes or the player finishes it or whatever the case may be. And then together you can identify what's missing from it, what tasks might still be in progress, so the whole team understands, look, I'm still working on that art, or I'm still working on getting that system working from a programmer. What looks like it's broken, or what has been worked on that probably isn't necessary now. You can also sort of go, well, actually, we don't need this whole other side of it now because this is really cool, so maybe we just stop working on that and focus all of our energy on this thing. That's your ability to kind of pivot is a term that we use and say, well, now we actually want to focus on this thing because we found that this is really good and it means that our energy can be better spent on something that's simpler or more effective. The project manager, here we go, can also keep track of bugs in the project. So when you go through and test it, and here's the thing, you will test it all the time. As soon as something new goes in, you should be testing it. Whether you worked on that thing or not, everybody needs to know what state the game is in or the product is in that you're working on at all times, because if you don't, then things will just lag. You'll go a week without playing it and then find out some weird thing's gone in that you didn't expect, or something's broken that was working before, and go, well, hey, hang on, how come I didn't know that was broken? The response that you get from your team will be because you didn't test it and you didn't play it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Always test what you're doing. So as I said earlier, depending on what type of game you're making, those different roles that I'm talking about might have different levels of commitment that are required, might have different levels of work. So if it's very art heavy, you might need everybody to pitch in on the art. If it's got lots of coding stuff that you need to do in it, then maybe you need other people to start to pick up the slack and help make everything function. Now, you're not limited to the roles that I'm outlining here. So that initial list that I've given and these ones I'm outlining, it's a really shallow, very, very simple subset of a wide range of different roles that you have in game development. But in terms of the groups that you'll be working in now, I think it's an important one to sort of understand what each of those jobs are and that they are separate jobs. You can all do them to a certain degree, but you should do the one that you're best at, and your team should know which one you are best at. So something like, music, you may need to bring someone on that can create music, or someone might need to make that their only job, whereas previously they were doing something else. Thinking about the strengths that your team has when contemplating your idea. Are you really awesome at some strange particular thing that might be useful in some way? You shouldn't underestimate how unique everybody is and what very bizarre knowledge or skill somebody has that might make things a bit easier, or allow them to do a particular job on the project in a very different way than you might otherwise expect. And that can be a really nice surprise in a team to sort of go, well, I didn't know you could do, I didn't know you could sketch. That's really cool. I like what you did. Let's get you doing some more of the art. Why didn't you tell us you could sketch? And that person goes, oh, because I didn't think I was very good and stuff. So, barrack for people and be supportive of your team because you are a team. Here we go. Here's the huge ones. And this applies to everything. I cannot stress this strongly enough. When you are having these conversations, actually listen to other people's ideas and input. Honestly listen to it and honestly think about it for a second. Don't just put up a filter of whether or not you, let's say, like that person, or you like the way they put that idea, or you think they're trying to stomp on your idea. Honestly contemplate it, because what's actually important is not that personal thing that you're feeling or that you're thinking. It's what is actually good for the project. A good idea is a good idea, even if it's from even if you don't like the way that it's put or you don't like how it came to be, okay? And this is a rule for life. Like, just think about it. There's a term that gets used in acting and drama, and it's the idea of yes and. And it's where if somebody's in like an improvised scene and they're making stuff up, someone goes, oh, isn't it nice to be in this fruit shop? And then the other person in the scene will say, we're not in a fruit shop, we're in space. well, that just kills everything. Nothing good is going to come out of that, because now it's totally broken that moment. And what that person has effectively done is shut down any collaboration that could be happening in that scene. And likewise, that happens in meetings and conversations. If you start from a point of view of yes and, if somebody says, hey, this would be a really cool idea if we did this, even if you don't think it's the best idea and you think there's a better idea, mentally you can say, yes, and if we looked at it from this point of view, that makes it an even stronger idea. Or you find a constructive way to build upon someone's idea and not be a jerk. I mean, it's not a rule. You don't always have to say yes to everything. I mean, that sounds stupid, but I just wanted to put it out there that actively considering where that person is coming from with that idea and what it means for the product is a really, really good skill to have and really important for collaborating with people. The other one is to think before you speak. Take a second to go, how am I saying this? Why am I saying it? Is it actually going to add to the discussion that's happening now? If people are having an argument, do you want to get involved in that argument? Or do you want to go, okay, how do I bring this back to us actually achieving what we need to achieve? How can I say, look, you guys can figure that out later. We need to be talking about this now. We need to make this decision, and even if you have to change the subject. What else have we got? Okay, so here's another big wall of text, but go with me here. I'm almost done. Totally have fun, but try not to get too distracted. So to follow on from what I was saying about thinking before you speak, if you have a word or a term that you can use in your group to go, we are getting way off track, Pokemon, or daffodil. And then everybody in the team, because you agree on that beforehand, will know, all right, maybe we are getting a little bit off track. Or somebody might go, no, it's important that we chase this up, but we can try and make this decision on a time limit. So setting a time limit on certain decisions before you actually all start brainstorming. So say, all right, if somebody says daffodil, then we've got 2 minutes to work something out. Otherwise, we put that idea on the back burner, or we have a separate meeting to talk about that, or we have a separate conversation about that. And not to shut people down, but to sort of go, all right, we have other things that we need to achieve. And the other thing is, remember, you are a team. You're all working together and you're pulling in the same direction. Collaborating with each other and cooperating, it sounds namby-pamby, but I have to tell you, after more than a decade doing this job, these are actually some of the most important skills that you can have. The ability to properly listen to what people are saying and honestly consider it and be constructive and collaborate with people is incredibly important. And the idea and the product that you create out of that cooperation is going to be better than what you would make if you just stuck to your guns and yelled everyone down and was a total jerk and ran roughshod over everybody else. So, I think I should probably leave that there because I have gone considerably over time. I will make this document, there are a few more slides available after this to kind of pull from and have a look at. But I do absolutely wish you the best of luck. And, I almost forgot that you actually need to have fun. That's the other thing. Making games is incredibly fun, incredibly challenging, but so rewarding when it works. So I strongly suggest that you all have a lot of fun with this. And I look forward to seeing you next week, where we will talk about how to take that idea that you create out of this sort of advice that I've given, that kind of elevator pitch and some of the risks and all of that kind of stuff, and actually break it down and work out how to go about determining those tasks and a strategy that you can use as a team to empower yourselves and actually make the whole thing a reality. Thank you very much for joining me. I look forward to seeing you all next week. All right. Cheers. Peace.